We are a covenantal community founded on love and a common devotion to our free faith. We welcome each other into this virtual space. We especially welcome our visitors. Perhaps you are new and seeing this on YouTube page later. We are so glad that you are here. We invite you to connect with us in the comments or via our website or Facebook page. We join with all member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association in affirming and promoting the inherent dignity and worth of each person, justice, equity, and compassion in all human relations and all systems of society. We bear witness to the pain and suffering of Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color in all communities across this nation, and we continue our commitment to dismantle systems of oppression in order to build a better world. Black Lives Matter. Our church website and Facebook page have information about our activities. Also, members and friends, please remember that the best way to stay updated on congregational news is to read the Newsnet emails, the weekly e-blasts, the monthly online newsletter, and our Facebook posts. We light this chalice as a beacon of our faith and as a reminder of our commitment to a free and responsible truth for truth and meaning. We worship together, though we are at a distance, by celebrating that which is sacred to us individually and collectively. All of our music today and every Sunday is performed and recorded by our music director, Ken McGuire. The prelude prepares us for the service. Our opening words today are from Christopher Hitchens. For years, I declined to fill out the form for my Senate press credential that asked me to state my race, unless I was permitted to put human. The form had to be completed under penalty of perjury, so I could not in conscience put white, which is not even a color, let alone a race. And I sternly declined to put Caucasian, which is an exploded term from a discredited ethnology. Surely the essential and unarguable core of Dr. King's campaign was the insistence that pigmentation was a false measure of mankind and an inheritance from a time of great ignorance and stupidity and cruelty, when one drop of blood could make you black. Our offertory music this morning will be Ain't Nobody Gonna Turn Me Around. Please enjoy following your breath as you listen to today's music. While the music plays, please share your joys and sorrows via direct chat to me, and I will read them out for the community after the music ends. Out of gratitude for all we have been given and all we have now, we share our resources because we love and trust each other, and because this church enriches our lives and empowers us to make our world better. We rely upon each other, members and friends, and we appreciate the payment of pledges and the generous donations to support the legacy, vision, and work of this church community. Contributions may be made by credit card by using the link that we are dropping into the chat box now, or that link will be available in the video description if you're watching this later. You can also write a check to UUCT. All non-pledged contributions will be divided between our Split the Plate recipient and our congregation. If you prefer to write a check to the selected organization, please mail it directly to the address in the link. Feel free to open a new window to make your contribution while the offertory music plays. By the work of our hands and the generosity of our hearts, our love is made real. Thank you for your gifts. Again, while the music plays today, please share your joys and sorrows via direct chat to me, and I will read them out for the community after the music. When we gather in loving community, We remember that we do not travel this earth alone. We share our lives and hold each other in meditative thought and reverence. From Shampa today, she wants us to remember that next Sunday, I guess, is the Druid City Pride Festival starting at 1:30. From Lynn, remembrance of my Uncle Gil, my mother's brother-in-law who died last week, a special loving man. And also to Susan. Scott, thank you for sharing your stories with us today and helping us having a better understanding of our history. We recognize all burdens and celebrations that went unspoken today. May the warm light of our chalice flames bring us peace. And now I'm delighted to introduce a speaker. Scott Bridges is the founder and co-president of Tuscaloosa Civil Rights History and Reconciliation Foundation. Since 2016, Scott Bridges has led community leaders in a search and discovery mission to document Tuscaloosa's role in the civil rights history. Although events in Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham are more well-known, Tuscaloosa's trail reveals compelling local stories of the struggles and courage of the oppressed peoples. Scott has agreed to stay with us during our coffee and discussion period, and we look forward to that moment. But in the meantime, welcome, Scott. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, good morning. I'm delighted to be here, and we have a fair amount of territory to cover, so I suggest we get started. First, I would offer you at least a couple of definitions of history. One is history is what we choose to remember. Another, which I like very much, is that history is the observation of patterns over time. So we're going to start the slideshow now, Lynn. So here we've arrived at Foster Auditorium. This is about a year ago at this very special moment where the president of the university and the football coach and football players stood on that stage and told us that things are going to be different, that we have come to a different place in our history. Go ahead, please. And again. And again. And this is in Government Plaza during the summer, where I believe that day there were about 5,000 participants gathered to talk about the George Floyd incident and what was going to happen next. Next slide. Many speakers that day. Next slide. Crowd was estimated at approximately 5,000. Next slide. So this is our bus. This is the bus that you will see driving around town increasingly in the future, and it seats about 24 people. We do tours with this bus. Go ahead. So normally I would include a foot soldier. In this case, it was Mr. Danny Steele. Go ahead. So this is part of how we get here. This is a speech of Alexander Stephens in 1861, often called the Cornerstone Speech, and you can read it. And of course, that conflicts with Jefferson's statement of all men are created equal. Next slide. So this begins our pattern. This is Capitol Park, where the capital of the state of Alabama was located. Embedded in the Constitution is a slavery clause. And here we will see many slave codes and so on, but this is not necessarily where we're going to stay. Go ahead, please. Downtown churches, Basil Manley, the first president of the University of Alabama, was also the minister at First Baptist Church, a slaveholder, a secessionist, and chaplain of the Confederacy. Next slide. Likewise, the old jail, which is downtown, has a great story to tell regarding the lynchings that take place immediately following the Civil War. Next slide. These are the churches that begin to form as the Civil War is complete. Next slide. Shandy Jones is the first Black legislator elected here in Tuscaloosa in 1868. Next slide. Bailey Tabernacle. Next slide. Charles Stillman will petition for and receive permission to start the Tuscaloosa Theological Seminary, which eventually will turn into Stillman College, 1876. Next slide. So by 80 years later, slavery at the federal level has been declared unconstitutional. The 1901, the Alabama Constitution will meet with an avowed intention to embed segregation into that Constitution, which it does. And that will reduce the ability of Black males to participate in the election process from 185,000 in 1900 to 6,000 in 1904. Next slide. Booker T. Washington will visit First African Church. Next slide. Murphy Collins House, which is the Murphy Collins African American Museum, and is an example of what was called the Lace Curtain District, or Black upper middle class in the 1920s. Next slide. Diamond Theater, some of you may remember it, opened in 1947. It was positioned one block off of Greensboro Avenue in what was called the Blue Front District. Next slide. Paul Jones, applicant to the university in 1949, was denied entrance, later gives his entire collection to the University of Alabama, his African-American art collection, now valued at well over $10 million. Next slide. So this is a touch of reality. This is Danny Steele standing in his front yard, approximately where the School of Music is. This would be in the 1950s. Next slide. And here we see Danny's house. Next slide. Just to show you that it's really there, here in the background, you actually see Memorial Coliseum. Next slide. And of course, this is the Donnie Washington Center downtown, an example of the Great Migration. Donnie Washington moves to Chicago. Next slide. Okay, Reverend Thomas Linton. This is one of what I refer to in our publicity blurb as one of Tuscaloosa's greatest hits. Reverend Linton is active in Tuscaloosa in every way, shape, and form relative to Tuscaloosa's civil rights from 1951 to 2019. He was actually in the barbershop. It was then called the Howard and Linton Barbershop when Arthurine Lucy was brought there in 1956. He witnessed her being taken back to the back to get cleaned up in the beauty shop that was in the back of the barbershop. And in the meantime, he and Mr. Howard made phone calls to get some Black drivers to come over and pick up Arthurine Lucy to return her to Birmingham, because there was a white crowd, a violent white crowd that had assembled outside. And eventually, after she is cleaned up, they arrive. It's an armed car, and she's put in that car and taken away safely and returned to Birmingham. In 1961, Reverend Linton will become part of what's called the Tuscaloosa Citizens Action Committee, which really represents the sort of formal inaugural committee relative to civil rights in Tuscaloosa. That is formed after an incident on a bus where 3 Stillman students are told where they can sit and where they can't sit, and there's an altercation. And that evening, the Tuscaloosa Citizens Action Committee is formed. Reverend Linton is one of the principal players, along with Reverend Willie Hertzfeld of the St. Peter's Lutheran Church. In 1964, Reverend Linton again appears on the scene as an incredibly valued member of the community. Both Dr. King and Attorney General Robert Kennedy have indicated that if there's any problem, that he is to stay out of jail, and that he will be responsible in terms of communication to and with Kennedy and King. Bloody Tuesday takes place in June of 1964, and following that, Reverend Linton is called to action, which I will explain when we get to that part. Following the Bloody Tuesday in 1964, he continues his work. There is a Tuscaloosa Human Rights Commission formed, and through that, he will continue to work with then Mayor Ward McFarland to enhance Black economic employment. Reverend Linton is the shop there is now the property of the city of Tuscaloosa, and we're hoping to turn that into a civil rights museum. Next slide. Okay, this is an important moment. This is again one of those moments in terms of national history that unfortunately Tuscaloosa arrives on the scene. Arthurine Lucy has successfully applied and come to the university. She's been in class, and following her Friday class attendance, which is with great stress, there's a crowd that's gathered on the following Saturday at the University in Greensboro Avenue intersection. 2 speakers speak that day, Leonard Wilson and Walter Flowers. I won't go into what they said, but I will read a little bit of the editorial that takes place 2 days later. At this point, the university has stated that Arthurine Lucy will be expelled because they can no longer guarantee her safety. Buford Boone has written numerous articles and editorials through that spring pleading for moderation. And of course, moderation is not achieved. So in this editorial, this is what he has to say. When mobs start imposing their frenzied will on universities, we have a bad situation. But that is what has happened at the University of Alabama. And it is a development over which the University of Alabama, the people of this state, and the community of Tuscaloosa should be deeply ashamed and more than a little afraid. Our government's authority springs from the will of the people, but their wishes, if we are to be guided by democratic processes, must be expressed by ballot at the polls, by action in the legislative halls, and finally by interpretation from the bench. No intelligent expression has ever come from a crazed mob, and it never will. And make no mistake, there was a mob in the worst sense at the University of Alabama yesterday. Every person who witnessed the events there with comparative detachment speaks of the tragic nearness with which our great university came to being associated with murder. Yes, we said murder. Quote, if they could have gotten their hands on her, they would have killed her. The target was Arthurine Lucy. Her crimes, she was born black, and she was moving against Southern custom and tradition, but with the law, right up to the United States Supreme Court on her side. What does it mean today at the University of Alabama and here in Tuscaloosa to have the law on your side? The answer has to be nothing. That is, if a mob disagrees with you and the courts. It's a moment of change in Tuscaloosa. It's a moment of change in the state of Alabama, and it forecasts the future. Next slide. Well, just down the street in the Alston building, the yellow building across from the Bama Theater, originally built in 1907, it was labeled the tallest building on a dirt road in America. How about that? On the fourth floor, from the 60s to approximately 1987, Robert Shelton was the man in charge of the United Klans of America, the KKK of Georgia, of Alabama, and Mississippi. He has his finger in a lot here in Tuscaloosa, but certainly in Montgomery, certainly in Birmingham, the bombings, the tragedy at the church, and so on, has his fingerprints on it. And Robert Shelton struts around Tuscaloosa for 25 years. I've yet to meet anyone who said, I'm from Tuscaloosa and I knew about Robert Shelton and the Ku Klux Klan. I find that it's similar to asking people, did you ever vote for George Wallace? I haven't found anyone that ever voted for George Wallace either. But this receives not only national attention, but international attention, and has been almost entirely swept under the carpet until we have sort of brought it back into, I think, its proper perspective, which is one of not only local and state, but national influence. Next slide. Go on. Next slide. So one of the questions that was asked us early on, we'll go back to Dr. King, please. One of the questions that was asked very early on was Dr. King ever in Tuscaloosa? And well, yeah, he was here, but no one could seem to find a picture of Dr. King in Tuscaloosa. And so, as you see, the photo here was taken in 1964 at the installation of T.Y. Rogers at First African Church, which would subsequently very, very quickly become the center, the middle for meeting place protests as organized by the dynamic leadership of Reverend Rogers, who had worked for a number of years as the assistant to Reverend King in Montgomery at Dexter. Now, the next slide. So that's March and April already, and almost immediately T.Y. Rogers organizes protests. In this case, you see marchers coming down Greensboro Avenue on their way to the new federal courthouse, which was promised to open and no longer have the colored only signs at water fountains and bathrooms and they find that has not taken place. And so Reverend Rogers organizes a series of marches to take place in Tuscaloosa. Next slide. So that's, as we saw in April. In June, or May, I should say, there's a cool down period in which the downtown businessmen are asked to consider integrating lunch counters and with the the carrot and the stick. If you don't, then there will be sit-ins. And of course, the businessmen do not respond positively to this, and there will be sit-ins. So in that first week of June, there's a series of sit-ins organized by T.Y. Rogers. Go ahead. And the result, and again, this is an incident of considerable violence that takes place June 9th, 1964, labeled here as Bloody Tuesday. And what you see then are the various pictures of people being placed in police vehicles. On the ground to the left is Maxie Thomas. He's been hit in the eye by a billy club. And up at the top there, you see people coming out of the church. There were about 500 people in the church that day, almost all of them 22 years of age and younger. This was almost entirely a student participating group. The older members of the Black community had been told in no uncertain terms, if you march, you will lose your job. So it's the students that will provide the leadership here during Bloody Tuesday. It's also the students that will go to jail and the students that will be injured. Eventually, 33 are taken to hospital and 93 are taken to jail. And it's that day then that Reverend Linton is called to action, because the students coming out of the church will run in all directions, many of them ending up down in the barbershop, where he will call in hospital, ambulance, and then escape out the back door to communicate with Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. Next slide. Now, I don't know if we can play this. We can add, this is actually some visual evidence of what happened that day. You want to give it a try? So there's the church. There's a watermark over the church. You can see the people out in front of the church. Now they're coming out. Tear gas has hit the building. There's T.Y. Rogers. He's being taken to his car. And there you can see the canisters of tear gas beginning to fall, having hit the church. The fire hoses. People trying to come out the side door and going back in. And then eventually running from the side and down the street, and you can see the police chasing after them. There's a person down on the ground. That's it. All right, this is an event that follows a month later. Jack Palance goes to what's called the Druid Theater downtown, where he is accosted by members of the audience, and the KKK forms outside. Eventually, a group of approximately 500 people throwing stuff. He has to be saved, rescued by the police chief, and for the rest of the summer, there's a curfew in Tuscaloosa. Next slide. This will end the boycott, the bus boycott, but as you see, Reverend Linton enters the picture. If you want our business, make public discrimination policies public. And a boycott ensues, which will end in 1965 when Tuscaloosa Transit is integrated. Next slide. This is the final slide, and one of the most moving events, I believe, visually. This is a crowd that forms sort of on its own, following the clubbing of Reverend James Reeb in Selma, where he's hit by a baseball bat, eventually will die. But this is a prayer vigil, and as you can see, that vigil stretches from University in Greensboro out of sight. So in terms of the highlights, if you will, or what's the most, what are these nationally significant moments in Tuscaloosa civil rights history? Well, without question, our Three and Lucy is a national moment. The Pulitzer Prize is a national moment. The KKK is a national moment. Dr. King and Reverend Rogers and Bloody Tuesday is a national moment. And likewise, the life and vision and constancy of Reverend Linton is likewise a national moment. So those things kind of form the nucleus, if you will, of what we believe is an important part of the national civil rights conversation, as well as obviously the conversation that we're beginning to have here in Tuscaloosa, which is inclusive of not only the downtown, but also Stillman and the University of Alabama. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Scott, for your wise words and very compelling information. We'll have some more questions for you in the coffee hour.
Great.
Our closing words today are from the Tuscaloosa Civil Rights Trail brochure. If you cannot march, you can make sandwiches. If you cannot make sandwiches, you can drive your car. If you cannot drive, you can help with office work. Everybody can do something. What will you do to help us win freedom? Our postlude music today is We Shall Overcome. As we extinguish this flame, let us remember that we carry the light within ourselves, which brings healing to a broken world and hope for the days ahead. Friends, let us be hopeful for the days ahead, living out love and kindness and working untiringly for justice. The service has ended. We invite those of you who are able to stay for virtual coffee and conversation. Let us go in peace.